The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. And running from a man like Marcus Vance, that's the kind of mistake that gets you buried in unmarked sand. Tonight, Lillian Vance made that mistake anyway. Because some things are worse than dying. Some cages don't have bars. They have wedding rings and locked doors and hands that leave bruises where dresses can hide them. And when you've spent 3 years becoming a ghost in your own skin, when you've forgotten what your own voice sounds like, sometimes the only choice left is the desperate one. So stick around. Watch how far one woman will run when there's nothing left to lose. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button. And let's begin. The rain came down like nails. Lillian's feet were already bleeding by the time she cleared the town limits, the rocky desert floor tearing through skin that hadn't touched bare ground in years. Her dress, what was left of it, clung to her body in heavy soaked folds, the ivory fabric Marcus had chosen for her now brown with mud and streaked with blood from the cut above her eye. She didn't look back. Couldn't. If she looked back, she'd see the lights of Dry Hollow, and if she saw the lights, she might remember that out here in the dark there was nothing. No water, no shelter, no plan beyond the animal instinct that screamed run. Lightning cracked the sky open, and for one brilliant second the desert lit up like noon. She saw it all, the endless scrubland stretching toward mountains that looked like broken teeth against the clouds, the scattered Joshua trees twisted into shapes that seemed almost human, the emptiness that would probably kill her before Marcus ever got the chance. Then darkness swallowed everything again. Her lungs burned. Each breath tasted like copper and dust. She'd been running for, how long? 20 minutes? An hour? Time had stopped making sense around the same moment she'd grabbed the whiskey bottle off Marcus's desk and brought it down across his temple hard enough to hear something crack. She remembered that sound. Would probably hear it forever. Would probably have nightmares about whether she'd hit him hard enough. The thought made her stumble, her ankle turning on a rock she couldn't see. She went down hard, palms scraping across caliche, the impact driving the air from her chest. For a moment, she just lay there in the mud, rain hammering against her back, and let herself think about stopping, about just staying down. It would be easier. Get up. Her own voice startled her, hoarse, unfamiliar. She hadn't spoken out loud in days. Marcus preferred silence at dinner, silence in the bedroom, silence everywhere except when he wanted to hear her say, "Yes, sir," or of course, "darling," or "I'm sorry, I won't do it again." Get up. She pushed herself to her knees, then her feet, kept moving. The rain had turned the desert into a maze of running water, every gully and wash suddenly alive with flash flood potential. She could hear it, the roar of water somewhere to her left getting louder. Had to move higher, had to... Hoofbeats. The sound cut through the rain like a blade, and her heart stopped. They'd found her already. Marcus had found her. She'd gotten maybe 2 miles, and it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough because men like Marcus Vance didn't let their property walk away, didn't let their wives embarrass them by running off into the desert like some kind of, "Lillian!" Not Marcus's voice. Younger, Jesse's voice. Marcus's foreman, the one who always watched her a little too long when he thought Marcus wasn't looking, who told her once that she was wasted on an old man who didn't appreciate what he had. She ran faster. "Lillian, stop! You're going to get yourself killed out here!" The wash appeared without warning, a dark slash across her path. She tried to stop, feet sliding in the mud, but momentum carried her over the edge. The world tilted. She fell, hitting the sloped bank hard, rolling, water soaking her to the bone as she splashed into the current at the bottom. Not deep. Maybe knee-high. But moving fast, pulling at her legs, trying to sweep her downstream where the wash would narrow and deepen, and hands grabbed her arms. She screamed, twisting, fighting, but the grip was iron strong. Someone hauled her up out of the water, lifting her like she weighed nothing. She swung blindly, felt her fist connect with something solid. Easy. A man's voice, not Jesse. Not Marcus. Deeper, with an accent she couldn't place in the dark and the rain in her panic. Lightning flashed again. She saw him for just a second, tall, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, long black hair plastered to his face by the rain. Apache, maybe, though she'd heard most of them had been driven out of this territory years ago. He wore a canvas duster that hung open over a plain shirt and worn pants, and his eyes. His eyes looked right through her like he could see every broken thing inside and wasn't particularly moved by any of it. Then the darkness came back, and she was fighting again, kicking, trying to wrench free. "Let me go!" He didn't, just held her there in the wash with water rushing past their legs and rain pouring down. His grip firm, but not painful. Not the way Marcus held her when he wanted to make a point. "You keep running this direction, you're dead before sunrise," he said. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "Wash feeds into the canyon. Water's already 6 feet deep down there and rising. I don't care. You will when you're drowning." More hoofbeats, closer now. At least 3 horses, maybe 4, and voices shouting her name against the storm. The stranger's head turned toward the sound. In the next flash of lightning, she saw his jaw tighten. "They with you?" he asked. "They're hunting me." He looked back at her, studied her for a long moment, her torn dress, her bleeding feet. The bruises she knew were blooming across her cheekbone and jaw. Then he looked toward the voices again. "Your husband?" "Yes." "He do that to your face?" She didn't answer, didn't have to. The stranger made a sound low in his throat, not quite a growl, not quite a sigh. Then he released one of her arms and pulled something from his belt. A knife, long-bladed, the metal gleaming dull in the darkness. Lillian went very still. He reached out and grabbed a fistful of her dress at the hem, yanked it up, and cut. The blade went through the soaked fabric like paper, and he kept cutting, shortening the dress to just below her knees. The ruined length of ivory silk fell away into the water and was gone. "Easier to move," he said, sheathing the knife. "Come on." He started up the washbank, pulling her with him. She should have fought, should have screamed, but something about the way he moved, efficient, purposeful, like he'd already made a decision and wasn't interested in discussing it, made her follow. At the top of the bank, his horse waited, a big paint gelding with a calm eye and mud splattered up to its chest. The stranger lifted her into the saddle like she was a child, then swung up behind her. "What are you—" "Quiet." He turned the horse away from Dry Hollow, away from the voices, and kicked it into a trot. The gelding responded instantly, finding its footing despite the darkness and the mud, moving with the kind of sure-footedness that spoke of years in this country. The voices fell behind. The rain kept coming. Lillian sat rigid in the saddle, very aware of the stranger's chest against her back, his arms on either side of her holding the reins. He smelled like sage and smoke and wet leather, felt solid as stone. "Where are you taking me?" she managed after a few minutes. "Away." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting right now." They rode in silence after that, the horse picking its way through the scrubland while lightning painted the world in brief, stark snapshots. Lillian tried to track their direction, but everything looked the same, endless desert punctuated by rocks and brush and the occasional skeletal tree. She should have been terrified. Should have been fighting to get away from this stranger who'd grabbed her out of the dark and thrown her on his horse like cargo. But she was just tired. So tired. Her head drooped forward. She caught herself, straightened, tried to stay alert. But the adrenaline that had carried her this far was burning off, leaving nothing but bone-deep exhaustion and pain from 100 different places. The stranger's arms were warm. The horse's gait was steady. And the rain was starting to ease, the storm moving on toward the mountains, leaving a silence broken only by hoofbeats and her own ragged breathing. She didn't realize she was crying until the stranger spoke again. "You hurt anywhere besides your feet and your face?" His voice was still flat, still emotionless, but there was something in the question that wasn't quite indifference. "No," she lied. "That's bullshit. I'm fine." "Yeah, you look fine." There was no sarcasm in his tone, just that same blunt observation. Lillian felt something hot and angry flare in her chest. "What do you want from me?" she snapped. "You want me to list every place he hit me? You want details? Fine. He backhanded me across the face during dinner because I didn't smile enough. He kicked me in the ribs when I fell. He grabbed my hair and—" Her voice cracked. She stopped talking. The stranger was quiet for a long moment. "I don't want a list," he said finally. "Just needed to know if you were bleeding somewhere I couldn't see." "Why do you care?" "I don't." But he pulled the horse to a stop anyway, dismounted, and came back with what looked like a shirt from his saddlebag. He handed it up to her, worn cotton, clean, dry. "For your feet," he said. "Tear it into strips." Then he swung back into the saddle, and they kept moving. Lillian held the shirt in her hands and tried not to think about the last time someone had given her something without expecting payment. Dawn came slow and gray. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but everything was still wet, the desert gleaming dull silver in the weak light. Lillian had given up trying to stay awake somewhere around midnight. She'd woken twice, once when the horse stumbled and the stranger's arm tightened around her waist to keep her from falling. Once when she'd heard voices in the distance and felt him go very still behind her until they faded. Now she woke to stillness and the smell of smoke. She was on the ground, wrapped in a blanket she didn't remember getting, lying close enough to a small fire to feel its heat. The stranger sat on the other side of the flames, feeding it bits of dried mesquite, his hat tipped low over his face. Lillian pushed herself up on her elbows, wincing as every muscle in her body protested. Her feet were bandaged, rough work, but thorough, the strips of shirt bound tight to stop the bleeding. Someone had cleaned the cut above her eye, too. She touched it gingerly, felt the sting of something astringent. "You're awake." She looked across the fire. The stranger had pushed his hat back, and she could see him properly for the first time. Maybe 30, maybe older. Hard to tell with a face that looked like it had been carved from rock and left to weather in the sun. Strong jaw, broad nose, high cheekbones. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and completely unreadable. "How long was I asleep?" Her voice came out rough as sandpaper. 4 hours. He reached into the fire, pulled out something wrapped in leaves, and tossed it to her. "Eat." She caught it reflexively, then sat up fully and unwrapped the leaves. Meat of some kind, tough and gamey, but still warm. Her stomach cramped with sudden, desperate hunger. She'd eaten half of it before she thought to ask, "What is this?" "Rabbit." "When did you eat?" "While you were sleeping." He stood up, walked to where his horse was hobbled near a patch of grass. "We'll rest another hour, then we need to move." "Move where?" He didn't answer, just checked the horse's hooves, ran a hand down its legs, made small adjustments to the saddle. Lillian finished the rabbit and wiped her hands on the blanket. Her dress, what was left of it, was still damp, starting to stiffen with dried mud. She looked down at herself and almost laughed. 3 hours ago, she'd been Marcus Vance's wife, living in the biggest house in Dry Hollow, wearing silk and sleeping on imported sheets. Now she looked like something that had crawled out of the desert to die. "I need to know where you're taking me," she said. The stranger adjusted the stirrup on his saddle, didn't look at her. "I'm taking you away from the men who are hunting you. That's all you need to know right now." "That's not... You got somewhere else you want to be?" He turned to face her, and there was something sharp in his expression now, something that might have been impatience or might have been anger. "You got family, friends, somewhere safe you can run to?" Lillian opened her mouth, closed it. "That's what I thought," he said. She looked away, heat rising in her face. He was right. She had nowhere. No one. Her parents were 10 years dead, her brother lost to a mine collapse in Nevada. Her friends, if she'd ever had any, long since scared away by Marcus's jealousy and her own shame. "I don't even know your name," she said quietly. He studied her for a moment, then went back to the horse. "KL. "That's it? Just KL?" "Just KL. "I'm Lillian Vance, I know. How? Everyone knows Marcus Vance's wife." He pulled the cinch tight, tested it. "Young thing he married 3 years back after his first wife died. Keeps her locked up in that big house. Doesn't let her talk to anyone. Hits her when she steps out of line." He glanced at her. "That about cover it?" The way he said it, flat, clinical, like he was describing the weather, made something twist in Lillian's stomach. "If you knew all that, why did you help me?" Cale swung into the saddle, walked the horse over to where she sat, looked down at her with those unreadable dark eyes. "Because I don't like men who hit women," he said, "and because Marcus Vance is a piece of shit who's had this coming for a long time." He reached down. She took his hand, rough, calloused, strong, and let him pull her up behind him. "Hold on," he said. She wrapped her arms around his waist, felt the lean muscle beneath his shirt, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. They rode into the brightening dawn, leaving the fire to burn itself out behind them. By midday, the desert was an oven. Lillian's dress was dry now, but that only made the heat worse. The sun beat down like a hammer, and there was no shade anywhere except the occasional shadow of a rock outcropping that they never stopped long enough to appreciate. Kyle kept them moving at a steady pace, always scanning the horizon, always listening. "Are they still following us?" Lillian asked at one point, her voice barely a whisper. Her throat was so dry it hurt to talk. "Probably." "How far behind?" "Far enough." She wanted to press for more, but he reached back and handed her a canteen. The water was warm and tasted like metal, but she drank anyway, forcing herself to take small sips even though she wanted to drain the whole thing. When she handed it back, their fingers touched. He didn't pull away immediately. "We'll reach water before dark," he said. "You can drink more then." "Where are we going?" "Ash River, about 30 miles south." "Is it safe there?" "Safe enough." She wanted to ask what that meant, but Kyle had already turned his attention back to the desert ahead, and something in the set of his shoulders told her the conversation was over. They rode in silence for another hour. It was late afternoon when they saw the dust cloud. Kyle spotted it first, reining the paint to a sudden stop and turning in the saddle to look back the way they'd come. Lillian followed his gaze and felt her heart drop. There, maybe 3 miles behind them, a smudge of brown against the pale sky. "How many?" she breathed. Kyle was already kicking the horse into a run. "Too many." The paint gelding stretched into a gallop, hooves pounding against the packed earth. Lillian held on tight, her arms locked around Kyle's waist, her face pressed against his back to keep the wind from tearing the breath out of her lungs. The desert blurred past, rocks, brush, the occasional flash of something green that meant water nearby. They crested a rise, and Lillian saw it, a line of cottonwoods in the distance, their leaves bright against the brown landscape. The river. Had to be. But the dust cloud was getting closer. She could hear them now, the thunder of multiple horses, the distant shout of men's voices. "Kyle, I know." He angled the horse toward an outcropping of red rock, pulling it to a sliding stop in the shelter of the boulders. Before Lillian could even dismount, he was on the ground, rifle in hand, checking the load. "Stay with the horse," he said. "What are you—" "Stay. With. The horse." He moved to the edge of the rocks, crouching low, his eyes on the approaching riders. Lillian could see them clearly now, 5 men on horseback, spread out in a line. Jesse was in the lead, his blonde hair visible even at this distance. No Marcus. Either he was still unconscious in Dry Hollow, or he'd sent his men to drag her back so he could deal with her personally. Lillian wasn't sure which option was worse. Kyle raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel. Then he lowered it again, his jaw tight. "They're going to pass north of us," he said, more to himself than to her. "If we're quiet, they might miss the tracks." "And if they don't?" He looked back at her. His face was completely expressionless, but something in his eyes made her stomach clench. "Then we find out if they're smart enough to turn around when I tell them to." The riders got closer, closer. Lillian held her breath, one hand on the paint's neck to keep it quiet. The gelding stood like a statue, ears forward but calm, 50 yards away now. 40. One of the riders, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his jaw, pulled his horse to a stop and pointed at the ground. Said something Lillian couldn't hear. Jesse wheeled his mount around, looking toward the rocks, looking right at them. "Shit," Cale said quietly. Jesse raised his hand and all 5 riders turned toward the outcropping. Cale stood up. "That's far enough," he called out. The riders stopped. Jesse sat forward in his saddle, squinting against the sun. "Well, hell," he said. "Didn't expect to find you out here, Cale." Lillian went very still. They knew each other. Of course they knew each other. Dry Hollow was a small town, and Kyle didn't seem like the kind of man who went unnoticed. "Turn around, Jesse," Kyle said. His voice was level, almost conversational, but the rifle in his hands was very steady. "This doesn't concern you." "See? That's where you're wrong." Jesse shifted in his saddle, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Mrs. Vance is my employer's property. She ran off, and we're here to bring her back. Now, I don't want any trouble with you, but she's not property. Legally, she's his wife. That's the same thing in this territory. Not anymore. Jesse's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? Means she's not going back. Means you're going to turn around and ride home and tell Marcus Vance that his wife is gone. Means if I see any of you following us again, I won't be as polite about sending you away. One of the other riders, the one with the scar, laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You threatening us, Indian? Cale's expression didn't change. Making you a promise. The man with the scar reached for his gun. Cale's rifle came up in one smooth motion, and the shot cracked across the desert like thunder. Dirt exploded 2 feet in front of the scarred man's horse. The animal screamed and reared, and the rider barely stayed in the saddle. Next one's not a warning, Cale said. Jesse raised both hands, palm out. Easy, Cale. Nobody needs to die today. Then right away. You know I can't do that. Marcus will have my head if I come back without her. Then I guess you've got a choice to make. They faced each other across the open ground. Jesse and his men on one side, Kyle standing alone with his rifle on the other. Lillian could feel the tension like a physical thing, stretched so tight that the wrong word, the wrong movement, would snap it. Jesse looked past Kyle, his eyes finding Lillian where she stood half hidden by the rocks. Lillian, he called out, this is stupid. You know that, right? You think running with some Apache drifter is going to save you? Marcus will find you. You know he will. And when he does, he shook his head. Come back with us now. I'll talk to him. Make him understand. You'll be all right. Lillian stepped forward, moving to stand beside Kyle. Her legs felt like water, but she made them hold her. I'm not going back, Jesse. Don't be stupid, girl. I'm not going back. Her voice cracked on the last word, but it didn't matter. She'd said it, out loud, in front of witnesses. Jesse stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Kyle, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. Marcus is going to put a price on both your heads, he said quietly. You understand that? Whatever you think you're doing here, it's not worth it. She's not worth it. Cale's rifle didn't waver. I think we're done talking. Jesse held his gaze for another few seconds. Then he turned his horse around. Let's go, he said to his men. The scarred man protested. We can't just... I said let's go. They rode away, but slowly, and Lillian could feel their eyes on her back the whole time. When they finally crested the ridge and disappeared, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. They'll be back, Kyle said, lowering the rifle. I know. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something flickered across his face, too fast for her to identify. You could have gone with them. I know that too. Why didn't you? Lillian thought about the big house in Dry Hollow, the locked doors, the careful way she'd learned to move through rooms so her footsteps wouldn't disturb Marcus when he was working, the way her own reflection had started to look like a stranger. Because being dead out here is better than being alive in there, she said. Cale studied her for another moment. Then he nodded once, short and sharp, like she'd passed some kind of test. Then we keep moving. They reached Ash River just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for a day that had started with blood and running. The river was smaller than Lillian had expected, more of a wide creek, really, but the water was clear and cold, fed by springs somewhere up in the mountains. Cottonwoods crowded the banks, their leaves rustling in the evening breeze, and she could hear birds settling in for the night. Cale led the paint down to the water, let it drink while he scanned the area. When he seemed satisfied they were alone, he dismounted and started stripping the saddle. Lillian slid down carefully, testing her weight on her bandaged feet. They hurt like hell, but they held her. There's a place about half a mile upstream, Kyle said, his back to her as he worked. Cabin. Not much, but it's got a roof. Whose cabin? Mine. She looked at him in surprise. You live out here? Sometimes. He finished with the saddle, let the horse wander to a patch of grass, and started gathering wood for a fire. Lillian stood there uselessly, watching him move with that same economical efficiency she'd noticed before. Everything he did seemed precise, deliberate, like he'd long ago figured out the minimum effort required and refused to waste a single motion beyond that. "Can I help?" she asked finally. He glanced at her torn dress, her bandaged feet. "You can sit down before you fall down." "I'm fine." "You're dead on your feet. Sit." There was no arguing with that tone. Lillian sat. Within 10 minutes, Kyle had a fire going and something cooking over it that smelled better than anything Lillian had eaten in months. Her stomach growled audibly. "When's the last time you ate?" Kyle asked, not looking up from the fire. "This morning. The rabbit." Before that. She had to think about it. 2 days ago? Maybe 3. Marcus didn't like me eating much, said I was getting soft. Cale's hands went still. Then he went back to turning whatever was cooking, his jaw tight. They ate in silence. More rabbit, some kind of root vegetable that Lillian didn't recognize but tasted sweet. Water from the river that was cold enough to make her teeth ache. When she was done, Cale handed her the blanket she'd woken up with that morning. "We'll walk to the cabin," he said. "It's not far, but your feet." "I can make it." She stood up to prove it, took 3 steps, and felt her knees buckle. Kyle caught her before she hit the ground, one arm around her waist, solid and steady. "Or I could carry you," he said. "You don't have to." "I know." He bent, slipped an arm under her knees, and lifted her like she weighed nothing. Lillian opened her mouth to protest, then realized she was too tired to care. She let her head rest against his shoulder. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Cale started walking, following the river upstream. "Doing what?" "Helping me. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Maybe I owe someone else." She wanted to ask what that meant, but his arms had tightened around her just slightly, and the look on his face said the conversation was over. The cabin appeared around a bend in the river, small, built from weathered wood with a stone chimney and a porch that sagged a little on one side. It looked like it had been there forever, like it had grown up out of the desert rather than being built. Kyle pushed the door open with his boot and carried her inside. One room, a fireplace, a narrow bed against the far wall, a table and 2 chairs, shelves with a few supplies, coffee, beans, a bag of cornmeal. Simple, spare, but clean. He set her down on the bed, and she sank into it like it was made of clouds. The mattress was thin, the blanket rough. But after 3 years of silk sheets that smelled like Marcus's cologne and felt like a prison, this lumpy bed in the middle of nowhere felt like heaven. "Thank you," she said. Cale nodded once. Then he went back outside to get the horse. Lillian lay there in the growing dark, listening to the sound of the river and the wind in the cottonwoods, and for the first time in 3 years, she fell asleep without being afraid of what would happen when she woke up. Lillian woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of an axe biting into wood. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling above her was rough-hewn planks instead of painted plaster, and sunlight was streaming through a window that had no curtains. Her body ached in places she'd forgotten could hurt, and her feet throbbed with each heartbeat. Then it all came back. The rain. The running. Kyle. She sat up slowly, wincing as her muscles protested. Through the window, she could see him outside. No shirt, just his pants and boots, swinging the axe in a steady rhythm that spoke of years of practice. Each strike was precise, economical, splitting the wood clean. Sweat gleamed on his back and shoulders despite the morning chill. She looked away, heat rising in her face. Marcus had never done physical labor, had paid men to do everything while he sat in his office and counted money. The coffee pot sat on the edge of the fireplace, still warm. Next to it, a tin cup and a plate with what looked like cornbread. Lillian's stomach cramped with hunger. She reached for the cup with shaking hands, poured coffee that was thick and black and probably strong enough to strip paint, and drank it anyway. The door opened. Kyle came in, saw her awake, and nodded once. "You look better," he said. "I look like hell." "Better than yesterday." He walked to the basin in the corner, poured water from a pitcher, and washed his hands and face. Lillian tried not to watch the way water ran down his arms, the play of muscle under skin. Tried not to compare him to Marcus, who was soft and pale and smelled like cigars and expensive cologne that couldn't quite cover the rot underneath. "There's food," Kael said, reaching for a shirt that hung on a peg by the door. "Eat. Then we need to talk about your feet." "What about them?" "They're infected." Lillian looked down. The bandages were stained dark with blood and something yellowish that made her stomach turn. She hadn't even noticed, hadn't let herself notice. "I'll take care of it," Kyle said, pulling on the shirt. "But it's going to hurt. Everything hurts already. This will be worse." He wasn't exaggerating. 20 minutes later, Lillian sat on the porch with her feet in a basin of water so hot it felt like fire, biting down on a leather strap while Kyle cleaned the wounds with something that smelled like turpentine and burned like the devil himself. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't make a sound. Wouldn't give Marcus that satisfaction even if he was 50 miles away. "Almost done," Kyle said quietly. His hands were gentle despite the pain he was causing, each touch careful and deliberate. "You did a number on these. Another day or two and you would have been in real trouble." "Didn't have shoes," Lillian managed around the leather strap. "I noticed." He wrapped her feet in clean bandages, then sat back on his heels and looked at her. Really looked at her, his dark eyes moving over her face like he was cataloging damage. "The cut above your eye is healing clean," he said. "Bruises will fade in a week or so, but you need rest, real rest. Not running, not looking over your shoulder, just rest. And if Marcus's men come back, then I'll handle it." The way he said it, flat, certain, made Lillian believe him. "Why?" she asked. The question had been burning in her chest since yesterday. "Why are you doing this? You could have let Jesse take me, could have stayed out of it entirely." Kale stood up, dumped the water from the basin over the porch railing, stood there with his back to her for a long moment. "I told you, I don't like men who hit women." "That's not a reason, that's an excuse." He turned to look at her, and for just a second, something flickered across his face, something dark and painful and quickly buried. "Maybe I know what it's like," he said quietly, "to be owned by someone, to have your choices taken away until you forget you ever had any." "You were a slave?" "Something like that." He went back inside before she could ask anything else, and Lillian sat on the porch watching the river and wondering what kind of past could put that look in a man's eyes. The days fell into a pattern after that. Kyle would wake before dawn, start the fire, put coffee on. Sometimes he'd hunt, disappearing into the desert for hours and coming back with rabbit or quail, or once a small deer that he butchered with the same efficiency he did everything else. Sometimes he'd work on the cabin, fixing the sagging porch, replacing boards in the roof, mending things Lillian hadn't even noticed were broken. He didn't talk much, would go whole days saying nothing beyond eat or rest or stay off those feet. But he wasn't unkind. Would leave her books he pulled from somewhere, worn volumes of poetry and adventure stories that looked like they'd been read 100 times. Would make sure she had water, food, clean bandages. Lillian spent most of the first week sleeping. When she wasn't sleeping, she was eating, real food, not the careful portions Marcus had allowed. Her body seemed desperate to make up for years of controlled hunger, and Kyle never commented on how much she put away, just kept cooking. By the second week, her feet had healed enough to walk short distances. She started helping where she could, washing dishes, mending a tear in Kyle's spare shirt, sweeping the cabin floor. Small things, but they felt important. One evening, she found herself standing at the stove, stirring a pot of stew, while Kyle sat at the table cleaning his rifle. It should have felt domestic, should have felt wrong, but it just felt normal. "I don't know how to thank you," she said without turning around. "Don't need thanks." "Yes, you do. You saved my life." The sound of the rifle being reassembled stopped. She glanced back and found him watching her with that unreadable expression. "You saved your own life," he said. "I just kept you from dying stupid." Despite everything, Lillian laughed. It came out rusty, unpracticed, but real. Kale's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Then he went back to the rifle. "Can I ask you something?" Lillian said after a moment. "You're going to anyway. How did you know Jesse?" Kale's hands stilled again. "We did business once, few years back." "What kind of business?" "The kind that doesn't bear repeating." That's not an answer. It's the one you're getting. Lillian turned around fully, leaning against the stove. You know everything about me, every ugly thing, but you won't tell me anything about yourself. There's nothing to tell. That's bullshit, and you know it. His eyes snapped up, something sharp in them now. You want to know about me? Fine. I'm Apache. Or I was, before my own people decided I wasn't worth keeping. I drift. I work when I need money. I stay out of towns because people like Jesse see my face and assume I'm there to rob them, or worse. That enough for you? Why did your people... We're done talking. He stood up, grabbed his hat, and walked out. The door didn't slam, but it might as well have. Lillian stood there in the silence, the stew bubbling behind her, and realized she'd pushed too hard. He didn't come back until after dark. Lillian had eaten alone, washed the dishes, and was sitting on the porch when she heard his footsteps on the path. He walked past her without a word, went inside, and she heard him moving around in the dark. I'm sorry, she called through the open door. Silence. I shouldn't have pushed. It's none of my business. More silence. Then his voice, quiet. You got nothing to apologize for. She heard him settle onto the floor near the fireplace. He'd been sleeping there since she arrived, giving her the bed without discussion. The blanket rustled as he pulled it around himself. Lillian stayed on the porch, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. The desert at night was a different world, cold and vast and full of sounds she was still learning to identify. Coyotes in the distance, the rustle of something small moving through brush, the constant whisper of the river. I made a choice once, Kyle said suddenly from inside. Wrong choice. People died because of it. My people. Family. Lillian turned in her chair, looking through the doorway. She could just make out his silhouette in the darkness. What happened? There was a man. White man. Army. Said he wanted peace. Said if we came in, laid down weapons, we'd be protected. Given land. Food. I believed him. His voice was flat, emotionless, but Lillian could hear the weight beneath it. I convinced my band to come in, convinced them to trust. And he lied. They were slaughtered, men, women, children, everyone except me because I'd gone hunting that morning. Came back to bodies and burned lodges and soldiers who said it was regrettable but necessary. Lillian felt something cold settle in her chest. That's not your fault. Tell that to the dead. The man who lied, he's the one responsible. And I'm the one who believed him. Same thing in the end. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words stuck in her throat. Who was she to talk about blame and responsibility? She'd stayed with Marcus for 3 years, had put on dresses and smiled and played the perfect wife while he slowly took everything that made her human. I don't blame you for running, Kyle said quietly, like he could read her thoughts. For waiting. For whatever you had to do to survive. You did what you had to do. So did you. Maybe. They sat in silence after that, and Lillian found herself thinking about guilt and survival and the weight of choices made in impossible situations. Eventually, she went inside, lay down on the narrow bed, and listened to Kyle's breathing even out into sleep. In the morning, he made coffee like nothing had happened, and they didn't talk about it again. The third week brought rain, not the violent storm that had driven Lillian into the desert, but steady, soaking rain that turned the river muddy and made the cabin feel smaller. They were stuck inside together, and for the first time the silence between them felt awkward. Lillian tried to read, but kept losing the thread of the story. Cale sat at the table, carving something from a piece of wood with a small knife, his movements precise and focused. Wood shavings piled up on the floor around his chair. What are you making? Lillian asked finally, just to break the quiet. He held it up. A bird, delicate and detailed, wings spread mid-flight. It's beautiful. He shrugged, went back to carving. Keeps my hands busy. Can you teach me? He looked up in surprise. Why? Same reason. Need something to do besides think. He studied her for a moment, then pulled out a second piece of wood from somewhere and handed it to her along with a smaller knife. Don't cut yourself, he said. She did, of course. 3 times in the first hour, until Kyle took the knife away and showed her how to hold it properly, his hands covering hers, guiding the blade. His touch was warm, rough, and Lillian found herself very aware of how close he was standing. "Like that," he said, stepping back. "Keep the blade moving away from you. Let the wood tell you where it wants to go." Wood doesn't talk. Not with words. They spent the rest of the afternoon carving. Lillian's piece looked like a misshapen lump compared to Kyle's bird, but he didn't comment on it, just carved his own piece and occasionally corrected her grip when she started to drift back to old habits. By evening, her fingers were cramping and she had a piece of wood that might, with generous interpretation, look like a turtle. "It's terrible," she said, holding it up. "It's a first try." "You're being kind." "I'm being honest. First tries are always terrible." He held up his bird, which now had individual feathers carved into the wings. "I've been doing this for 20 years. "What do you do with them? The carvings?" "Leave them places. Give them away sometimes." He set the bird on the table, ran a thumb over its head. "My mother taught me. Said it was important to make beautiful things, to prove the world wasn't all blood and fire." Was she right? Kyle looked at the bird for a long moment. "Some days I think so. Other days I'm not sure." That night, Lillian woke to the sound of Kyle crying out in his sleep. Not loud. A harsh, choked sound that cut off almost as soon as it started. She lay in the dark, listening to him breathe hard and fast, fighting something she couldn't see. She should have stayed in bed, should have given him privacy. Instead, she got up and went to where he lay by the fireplace, knelt down beside him in the dim glow of the banked coals. "Kyle," she said quietly, "wake up." His eyes snapped open, and for a second she saw something wild there, something dangerous. His hand went to the knife at his belt. "It's me," Lillian said, not moving. "Just me. You were dreaming." He stared at her, breathing hard. Then recognition came back, and he released the knife and sat up, running both hands over his face. "Sorry," he said roughly. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." She sat back on her heels. "Do you want to talk about it?" "No." "Do you want me to go away?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression softened. "No," he said again, but quieter. So she stayed, sat there on the floor beside him, while the rain drummed on the roof and the fire burned low. Neither of them spoke. After a while, Kyle lay back down, and Lillian found herself lying down too, close enough to feel the warmth from his body, but not touching. She woke just before dawn to find his arm around her waist, her back pressed against his chest. Neither of them had meant it to happen, but neither of them moved away. By the fourth week, Lillian's feet had healed completely, and the bruises on her face had faded to yellow-green shadows. She could work now, really work, not just the light tasks she'd been doing before. She started taking over the cooking entirely, partly because she was better at it than Kyle, and partly because she needed to feel useful. One morning, she woke to find him already gone, a note left on the table in rough handwriting. "Hunting, back by dark." She spent the day cleaning the cabin properly, scrubbing the floor, washing the blankets in the river, airing out everything that smelled like smoke and sweat. It felt good to work. Felt good to make this place better, even if it wasn't really hers. When Kyle came back that evening, he stopped in the doorway and looked around at the clean floor, the fresh blankets, the windows that had been scrubbed until they actually let in light. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "I wanted to." He set down the deer he'd killed, walked to the fireplace, and stood there looking into it. "This can't last," he said quietly. "You know that, right? Marcus won't stop looking. Eventually someone will see smoke from the chimney or tracks by the river. Eventually, they'll find us." "I know." "And when they do, we'll deal with it." He turned to look at her. "We? You think I'm leaving?" Lillian set down the knife she'd been using to cut vegetables. "You think after everything I'm just going to run again? I think you should. Think you should get as far from Dry Hollow as you can, start over somewhere they don't know your face." "Without you?" The question hung in the air between them. Cale looked away first. "I'm not good for you," he said. "I'm not good for anyone. Everything I touch turns to blood and fire. And you've had enough of that." "That's not true. You don't know me. Not really. You don't know the things I've done. So tell me. No. Why not? Because, his voice rose, sharp and sudden. Because you'll look at me different. Because you'll see what I really am, and you'll realize you're safer with Marcus than you ever will be with me. Lillian crossed the room to stand in front of him, close enough to touch, but she kept her hands at her sides. You want to know what I see when I look at you? She said quietly. I see a man who didn't have to help me but did anyway. Who took care of me when I couldn't take care of myself. Who gave me a safe place when I had nothing. So no, I don't care what you did before. I care about who you are now. You're making a mistake. Then it's my mistake to make. They stared at each other, and Lillian saw the moment he stopped fighting. Saw his shoulders drop, his jaw unclench, something in his eyes shifting from resistance to resignation. You're stubborn, he said. I've been told. And reckless. Runs in the family. His mouth twitched, almost a smile. That night they ate together at the table instead of in awkward silence. Talked about small things, the weather, whether they needed more firewood, if the roof would hold through another rain. Normal things. Domestic things. When Lillian went to bed, Kyle spread his blanket by the fireplace like always. But this time, when she woke in the middle of the night, she found him sitting in the chair by the window, rifle across his lap, watching the darkness. Can't sleep? She asked. Just keeping watch. You think they're close? I think being careful keeps people alive. She got up, wrapped the blanket around herself, and went to sit on the floor beside his chair. He looked down at her, eyebrow raised. What are you doing? Keeping you company. You should sleep. So should you. He sighed, but didn't argue. They sat there together in the dark, watching the desert slowly brighten toward dawn, and Lillian thought about how strange it was that this felt more like home than the big house in Dry Hollow ever had. The 5th week brought a visitor. Lillian was hanging laundry when she heard the horse, just one, moving slow. Her heart jumped into her throat, and she dropped the shirt she'd been holding and ran for the cabin. Kyle! He was already at the door, rifle in hand, his face hard. He motioned her behind him, then stepped out onto the porch. The rider came into view, an old man on an older horse, both of them looking like they'd seen better days. He raised one hand in greeting, the other staying visible on the saddle horn. Easy, Kyle, he called out. Just me. Kale relaxed slightly but kept the rifle ready. Thomas, what are you doing out here? Could ask you the same thing. The old man's eyes went to Lillian, still half hidden behind Kyle. Though I guess I got my answer. She's none of your business. Maybe not, but Marcus Vance's men have been through 3 times asking about her. Offered money, lots of it. Lillian felt her stomach drop. Kale's jaw tightened. And I told them I hadn't seen nothing, but they're getting desperate, widening the search. Won't be long before they check every canyon, every water source. Thomas shifted in his saddle. You need to move, both of you. Where? Mexico, if you're smart. Put enough distance between you and Dry Hollow that Marcus's money doesn't reach. I'm not running to Mexico. Then you're a fool. The old man looked at Lillian again. Both of you are. This won't end well. Men like Marcus Vance don't let go of what they think belongs to them. She doesn't belong to anyone, Kyle said flatly. Tell him that when he shows up with 20 armed men. They stared at each other. Kyle and this old man who somehow knew him, who'd ridden out here to warn them despite the risk. Finally, Thomas touched his hat. You always were stubborn, just like your father. He turned his horse. Watch your back, KL, and keep that girl safe. She's got more spine than sense, running off like she did. He rode away, and Lillian watched him go with a sinking feeling in her chest. We should leave, she said quietly. He's right. We can't stay here. Yes, we can. Kale, this is my land, my home. I'm not giving it up because Marcus Vance thinks he owns people. It's not about the land. Then what's it about? He turned to face her, and there was something fierce in his eyes now, something she'd never seen before. You want me to run, to keep running until there's nowhere left to go? I've done that, spent years doing nothing but running, and I'm done. So you'll just wait here until they come and kill you? If that's what it takes. That's stupid. Maybe. But it's my choice. Lillian wanted to scream, wanted to hit him, wanted to make him see that dying for a principle was just dying, and she'd already lost too much to watch him throw his life away. Instead, she turned and walked down to the river, sat on the bank with her arms wrapped around her knees and watched the water flow past. Cale found her there an hour later, sat down beside her without speaking. "I won't leave you," Lillian said finally. "So if you're planning to stay here and make a stand, I'm staying too." "That's stupid." "Your words, not mine." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You're going to get yourself killed. Then we'll be dead together." They sat there as the sun moved across the sky, and eventually Kyle reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused, warm, real. "I don't want you to die for me," he said quietly. "I'm not dying for you. I'm living for myself. There's a difference." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression, like he was seeing her for the first time. Not the broken woman who'd fled into the desert, but whoever she was becoming. "All right," he said, "we stay. But we do it smart. We prepare." "Prepare how?" "I'll show you." They spent the next 2 days turning the cabin into something that could be defended. Cale taught her to shoot, not fancy, just point and pull the trigger. They moved supplies into the small root cellar he'd dug out behind the cabin, stocked it with water and food and ammunition. He showed her the paths through the rocks, where a person could move without being seen, the places where the river was shallow enough to cross. "If something happens to me," he said on the third day, "you run. Don't look back. Don't try to fight. Just run. Follow the river south for 3 miles, then cut east toward the canyon. There's a settlement there, Mexican traders. They'll help you. I'm not leaving you." "Lillian." "No." She looked him in the eye. "I've run enough. I'm done running." He stared at her, and she watched something break in his expression, some last wall he'd been holding up. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones. "You're going to be the death of me," he said roughly. "Good thing I know how to shoot now." He kissed her then, sudden and fierce and desperate, like he'd been holding it back for weeks and couldn't anymore. Lillian kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, and felt something inside her chest crack open, something that had been locked away for so long she'd forgotten it was there. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kyle rested his forehead against hers. "This is a bad idea," he said. "Probably. We should stop." "We should." Neither of them moved. That night, Lillian didn't sleep on the bed and Kyle didn't sleep on the floor. They lay together under the blankets, her back against his chest, his arm around her waist, and watched the firelight dance on the ceiling. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lillian felt something that might have been happiness. But outside, the desert wind was picking up, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant rain. And somewhere in the darkness, men were riding closer. The warning came 3 days later, just after dawn. Kyle was already up, standing on the porch with his coffee, watching the desert wake up in shades of pink and gold. Lillian was still in bed, half asleep, listening to the morning sounds, birds starting their chatter, the river flowing steady, Kyle's boots creaking on the old wood. Then the boots stopped. She heard the coffee cup hit the porch rail, heard Kyle move fast, his hand on the rifle he kept by the door. "Lillian, get up, now!" The tone of his voice had her on her feet before she was fully awake, reaching for her boots, her heart already hammering. She stumbled to the door and looked where he was looking. Smoke. A thin column of it rising maybe 2 miles east, near the place where the canyon narrowed. "Could be a campfire," she said, hearing the hope in her own voice and hating it. "At dawn? In that exact spot?" Kyle's jaw was tight. "That's a signal. Someone telling someone else they found something." "Found us?" "Yeah." He was already moving, grabbing the saddlebags, checking his rifle and pistol, his movements quick and precise. No wasted motion, no panic, but Lillian could see the tension in his shoulders, the hard set of his mouth. "How much time do we have?" she asked. "If they're smart, they'll wait until they have enough men, circle around, come at us from multiple directions." He shoved ammunition into the saddlebag. "That gives us maybe an hour, maybe 2 if we're lucky." "And if they're not smart?" Then they're already on their way. Lillian felt her stomach drop, but she forced herself to move. Grab the bag they'd packed for exactly this situation. Water, food, extra ammunition, the few things that mattered. Her hands were shaking, but they worked. "We could still run," she said, even though she knew what he'd say. "We could." Kyle walked to the window, looked out at the smoke still rising in the distance. "But they'd just follow, and next time we might not see them coming. So we make a stand." "So we make a stand." He turned to face her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her against him, one hand tangled in her hair, the other tight around her waist. "If this goes bad," he said against her temple, "you run. You hear me? You take the horse and you run south like I showed you, and you don't look back. Kyle, promise me." She wanted to lie and tell him what he needed to hear, but she'd spent 3 years lying to make a man feel better, and she was done with that. "No," she said, "we do this together or not at all." He pulled back to look at her, and she saw anger flash across his face, then resignation, then something that might have been pride. Stubborn woman. "You knew that already." He kissed her hard, desperate, like it might be the last time. Maybe it would be. When he pulled away, his eyes were dark and serious. "Stay behind cover. Don't try to be a hero. And if I tell you to shoot, you shoot. Don't hesitate. Don't think. Just pull the trigger." "I know." "And Lillian?" He cupped her face in his hands. "Whatever happens today, this wasn't a mistake. You hear me? You running, us being here, none of it was a mistake." Her throat was too tight to speak. She just nodded. The sound of horses came 20 minutes later. Cale was on the roof, lying flat with his rifle, using the chimney for cover. Lillian was in the cabin, crouched by the window with the pistol he'd taught her to shoot, her palms sweating against the grip. They'd moved everything they could into the root cellar, dampened the roof to keep it from burning, done everything Cale could think of to give them a chance. It wouldn't be enough. They both knew it, but they were going to try anyway. "How many?" Lillian called up through the open window. 8, maybe 9? Cale's voice was calm, conversational, like he was commenting on the weather. "Jesse's with them. And someone else. Big man on a black horse." "Marcus." Lillian felt ice slide down her spine. Of course he'd come himself. Of course he wouldn't trust anyone else to drag her back. "They're stopping," Kyle said. "About 200 yards out, talking." "What do we do?" "We wait. Let them make the first move." The waiting was worse than anything. Lillian crouched there with the pistol growing slick in her hands, listening to her own heartbeat thunder in her ears, and tried not to think about all the ways this could end. Tried not to picture Kyle bleeding out on the roof, or herself dragged back to Dry Hollow in chains, or both of them dead in the dirt while Marcus stood over them and smiled. "Kyle," a voice carried across the desert, Jesse's voice. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk." Cale didn't answer. "Come on, man. Don't make this harder than it has to be, mister. Vance just wants his wife back. You give her up. We ride away. Everybody lives. Simple." "Tell Marcus," Cale called back, "that his wife is dead, died in the desert 3 weeks ago. Buzzards got what was left." A pause, then laughter. Marcus's laughter, rich and cultured and full of malice. "Really, Kyle? That's the best you can do?" Marcus rode forward a few paces, close enough that Lillian could see his face through the window. He looked the same, silver hair perfectly combed, expensive clothes, that smile that never reached his eyes. The only difference was the bandage wrapped around his head where she'd hit him with the bottle. "I can see smoke from your chimney," Marcus continued. "I can see laundry hanging on your line. You think I'm stupid enough to believe she's dead? Worth a try. Send her out, and I'll let you live. You have my word." "Your word isn't worth spit." Marcus's smile tightened. "Fine. We'll do this the hard way. Boys?" The gunfire started before he finished speaking. Bullets slammed into the cabin walls, shattered the windows, tore through the air where Lillian had been standing seconds before. She threw herself flat, glass raining down around her, her ears ringing from the noise. On the roof, Kyle returned fire. She heard his rifle crack once, twice, and someone screamed. Then more shots, concentrated on the roof now, and she heard Kyle curse and scramble for new cover. "You all right?" she shouted. "Fine, stay down." The shooting stopped as suddenly as it started. In the ringing silence, Lillian heard Marcus's voice again. "Last chance, Kyle. Send her out or we burn you both." "Go to hell." "Suit yourself." "Jesse?" Lillian saw movement through the broken window. 2 men running forward with torches, using the rocks for cover. Cale shot at them, but they were fast, dodging, and the angle from the roof was bad. One of them got close enough to throw his torch onto the porch. The dry wood caught instantly. "Kyle!" "I see it. Hold on." He slid down from the roof, dropped to the porch, and tried to kick the torch away. But the fire had already spread, hungry and bright, eating up the old timber like it had been waiting for this moment. Another torch came flying through the broken window, landed on the floor near the bed. "Out the back," Kyle said, grabbing her arm. "Now!" They ran for the back door, Lillian clutching the pistol, Kyle covering them with the rifle. The cabin was filling with smoke, thick and black, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. Behind them, something crashed, part of the roof giving way. Kyle kicked the back door open, and they stumbled out into the morning light. The root cellar was 20 feet away, and beyond that, the rocks that led down to the river. They almost made it. The shot came from somewhere to the left, and Kyle went down hard, his rifle skittering across the ground. Lillian screamed and dropped beside him, saw blood spreading across his shoulder, saw his face go white with pain. "I'm fine," he managed. "Keep going." "Like hell." She got her arm under his good shoulder and hauled him up. He was heavy, his weight nearly pulling her down, but she'd spent 6 weeks doing hard work and eating real food, and she was stronger than she'd been. She got him moving, stumbling toward the rocks. More shots, dirt exploding around their feet. A bullet whined past so close she felt the air move. Then they were in the rocks, hidden, and Lillian half-dragged, half-carried Cale down the slope toward the river. "Leave me," he said through gritted teeth. "Take the horse and run." "Shut up." "Lillian, I said shut up." She got him behind a boulder large enough to provide cover and shoved the pistol into his good hand. "Stay here. Shoot anyone who comes down that slope." "Where are you going?" But she was already moving, scrambling back up through the rocks toward the burning cabin. She could hear men's voices, close now, searching. Could smell the smoke thick in the air. The paint gelding was where they'd left him, tied to a tree near the cabin, dancing nervously as the fire crackled and roared. Lillian ran to him, got his lead untied with shaking hands, swung up onto his bare back. A man stepped out from behind the cabin. The scarred one from the first chase. He raised his pistol, and Lillian kicked the horse forward. The gelding responded like it had been waiting for this, charging straight at the man. He dove aside, his shot going wild, and they were past him, heading for the open desert. "There, she's running." Hoofbeats behind her. 2 riders, maybe 3, breaking away from the group to give chase. Lillian bent low over the horse's neck, urging him faster. The gelding stretched out into a full gallop, eating up the ground, but the riders behind her were gaining. She had to lead them away from Kyle. Had to give him time. A shot cracked past her head. Another hit the ground nearby. The horse swerved, and Lillian nearly lost her seat, grabbed a handful of mane, and held on. Her eyes were streaming from the wind, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Then she saw it. The wash where Kyle had pulled her from the water that first night. It was dry now, the storm weeks past, just a deep cut in the earth with steep banks. She turned the horse toward it. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on, you can do it." The gelding gathered himself and jumped, launching over the wash in one powerful leap. They landed hard on the other side, and Lillian's teeth clacked together, but they were across. Behind her, the first rider tried to follow. His horse balked at the edge, planted its feet, and the rider went flying over its head into the wash. She heard the impact, heard him scream. The other 2 riders pulled up short, looking for a way across. Lillian wheeled the gelding around and pulled Kyle's pistol from her waistband. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it, but she pointed it at the riders and pulled the trigger. The recoil nearly knocked her off the horse. The shot went wide by 10 feet, but the riders hesitated, and that was all she needed. She turned the horse and galloped back the way she'd come, taking a wide circle through the desert. By the time she got back to the river, the cabin was a skeleton of flame and smoke. the roof completely gone, the walls starting to collapse. Men were standing around it, talking, arguing. Marcus was shouting at Jessie about something. None of them saw her slide down the riverbank and drop from the horse into the shallow water. She waded upstream, the water cold and moving fast, staying low. The rocks were slippery under her feet, and once she fell, went under, came up gasping and soaked. But she kept going until she reached the place where she'd left Kyle. He wasn't there. Panic clawed at her throat. She looked around wildly, saw a trail of blood leading further upstream, and followed it. Found him 20 yards away, propped against a rock with his rifle across his lap and his face the color of old paper. "You came back," he said. His voice was thin, strained with pain. "Of course I came back, you idiot." She dropped beside him, pulled his shirt aside to look at the wound. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, in the front, out the back. But he was losing blood fast. Too fast. "I need to stop the bleeding," she said. "Don't have time. They'll come looking soon. Then we'll have to be fast." She tore strips from her already ruined dress, packed them into the wound as tightly as she could. Kyle made a sound low in his throat, but didn't cry out. When she had it bandaged as well as she could with shaking hands and inadequate materials, she sat back. "Can you ride?" she asked. "Can I walk?" "Not well." "Then I guess we'll find out." She got him up somehow, got him on the horse with her behind him to keep him from falling. They moved slowly, following the river south like Kyle had shown her, staying in the water where they wouldn't leave tracks. Every few minutes, she had to stop and readjust her grip to keep him upright. He was fading, his head dropping forward, and she knew if they didn't find help soon, the blood loss would kill him before Marcus ever got the chance. They'd gone maybe 2 miles when Kyle spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "The canyon. Cut east at the big cottonwood." "I remember." "Mexican settlement. Ask for Elena. Tell her I sent you." "You can tell her yourself." "Lillian, you're not dying. I won't let you." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Not up to you." "Like hell it isn't." She kicked the horse faster. The canyon appeared as the sun was reaching its peak, a narrow slash in the rocks that looked like nothing until you got close enough to see the path winding down into it. Lillian followed it, the horse picking its way carefully over loose stone, and found herself in a hidden valley with a stream running through it and a cluster of adobe buildings tucked against the far wall. People came out as she approached, men, women, children, all of them stopping to stare at the soaked, bleeding woman on a horse with a half-dead man slumped in front of her. "Elena!" Lillian called out, her voice cracking. "I need Elena. Kyle sent me." An old woman stepped forward, her face creased with years and weather. She took one look at Kyle and started shouting in Spanish. People rushed forward, helping Lillian get him down from the horse, carrying him toward the nearest building. "You Lillian?" the old woman asked in heavily accented English. "Yes, how did you—" "Kyle told me about you. Weeks ago. Said if you showed up, I should help." She looked at Lillian with sharp, assessing eyes. "He also said you were stubborn and wouldn't leave him. He was right. Can you save him?" Elena looked at Kyle, at the blood-soaked bandages, at his pale, unconscious face. "Maybe," she said. "If we're lucky." They worked on him for hours. Lillian sat outside the room where they'd taken him, her back against the wall, her hands clasped between her knees. She could hear voices inside, Elena giving orders in Spanish, someone bringing water, someone else bringing clean cloth. Once, she heard Kyle cry out, and she nearly broke down the door. But one of Elena's daughters, a woman about Lillian's age with kind eyes, put a hand on her shoulder and shook her head. "Let them work," she said softly. "You can't help him by interfering." So Lillian sat and waited, and tried not to think about Kyle dying on a table in a room she couldn't enter while she sat useless on the other side of a door. Someone brought her food. She couldn't eat. Someone brought her water. She drank it without tasting it. The sun moved across the sky outside, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and red, and still the door stayed closed. Finally, as the light was fading toward evening, Elena came out. She looked tired, her hands stained with blood, but her expression was neutral. "He'll live," she said. lost a lot of blood, and he'll be weak for a while. But the bullet didn't hit anything vital. He was lucky. Lillian felt something break loose in her chest, relief so intense it made her dizzy. Can I see him? He's sleeping. Best thing for him right now. Elena sat down beside her with a grunt, her old bones protesting. You want to tell me what happened? So Lillian did. Told her about Marcus, about running, about Kyle finding her, about the cabin burning and the men chasing them. Elena listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. Kyle always did have a talent for finding trouble, she said when Lillian finished. Even as a boy, his mother used to say he was born contrary. You knew his mother? I knew his whole family, before the soldiers came, before… She trailed off, shook her head. That's his story to tell, not mine. But I'll say this. He's a good man. Better than he thinks he is. And if he chose to help you, it's because he saw something in you worth saving. I don't know if I was worth it. Then you're as stupid as he is. Elena stood up, her joints cracking. You can go in now, but let him sleep. He needs rest more than he needs company. The room was small and simple. A bed, a table, a window that looked out on the canyon. Kyle lay in the bed, his shoulder wrapped in clean white bandages, his face still too pale but peaceful in sleep. Someone had cleaned him up, washed away the blood and dirt, and he looked younger somehow, more vulnerable. Lillian pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, took his hand in hers, the one not injured, and held it gently. You're not allowed to die, she whispered. You hear me? You promised to keep me safe, and you can't do that if you're dead. So you have to wake up. You have to get better. Because I didn't run away from Marcus just to watch you bleed out in some canyon. His fingers twitched in hers. Not much, but enough. She stayed there all night, holding his hand, watching him breathe, and sometime around dawn his eyes opened. You're still here, he said, his voice rough as gravel. Where else would I be? Somewhere safe. I am somewhere safe. I'm with you. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened. The cabin? Gone. Burned to the ground. The horse? With Elena's people. Marcus? I don't know. I got away before… Hey. She swallowed hard. Before they could catch me. Kyle closed his eyes, his jaw tight. I should have been faster. Should have seen them coming sooner. You saved my life. Again. Almost got you killed. Again. Stop it. She squeezed his hand. We're both alive. That's what matters. He opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw something shift in his expression, saw the moment he stopped fighting whatever had been holding him back. Come here, he said quietly. She leaned down, and he raised his good hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. I'm sorry, he said, about the cabin, about everything. I don't care about the cabin. It was all I had. No. She covered his hand with hers. It wasn't. He pulled her down into a kiss, gentle despite everything. When they broke apart, he was smiling, just slightly, just enough. You're still the stubbornest woman I've ever met, he said, and you're still an idiot. Yeah, but I'm your idiot. She laughed, and it came out half sob, but it was real. They stayed in the canyon for 2 weeks while Kale healed. Elena fed them, gave them a place to sleep, asked no questions. Her people were kind, bringing food and clean water, keeping watch at the canyon entrance in case Marcus's men came looking. But Marcus didn't come. On the 10th day, a trader passing through brought news from Dry Hollow. Marcus Vance's men had searched for days, found the burned cabin and evidence of a fight, but no bodies. Some thought Kyle and Lillian had died in the fire. Others thought they'd escaped into Mexico. Marcus himself had put up a reward, $500 for information leading to Lillian's return. But he'd stopped looking personally, had gone back to Dry Hollow and his business and his whiskey, and told everyone who'd listened that his wife had been a disappointment anyway. He's giving up? Lillian asked when Elena told her. Or he's setting a trap, waiting for you to think you're safe and come back. Elena stirred the pot she was cooking. Men like him don't let go easy. We're not going back. Good. Because the minute you set foot in that town, you're dead. Both of you. That night, Lillian and Kyle sat on the edge of the canyon, looking out at the desert under a sky full of stars. His arm was still in a sling, but the color had come back to his face, and he could walk without help. What do we do now? Lillian asked. We can't stay here forever. No, but we can stay long enough to figure out what comes next. And what does come next? He was quiet for a long time, his good hand resting on her knee. We go back, he said finally. Lillian turned to stare at him. Are you insane? Elena just said, not to Dry Hollow, to the river, to what's left of the cabin. There's nothing left. Then we rebuild. Kyle, I'm done running, Lillian. Done letting men like Marcus take what's mine. That land, that place by the river. It's all I have. And I'm not giving it up. He looked at her, his eyes dark and serious. But I'm not asking you to stay. You could go anywhere, start fresh somewhere Marcus's name doesn't reach. You'd be safe. Safe and alone. Safe and free. She thought about it, really thought about it, about going to California or Colorado or somewhere even farther, about changing her name and her hair and her whole life, about forgetting Marcus and Dry Hollow and everything that had happened, about never seeing KL again. No, she said. Lillian. I said no. We rebuild together or not at all. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, a real smile, the kind she rarely saw. You're going to get us both killed, he said. Probably. But we'll go down fighting. Damn right we will. He kissed her there on the edge of the canyon with the stars wheeling overhead and the desert spreading out forever in all directions. And when they broke apart, Lillian knew that whatever came next, whether it was Marcus or his men or something worse, they'd face it together. 2 days later, Kyle was strong enough to ride. Elena gave them supplies, fresh bandages, a warning to be careful. Her daughter gave Lillian a dress that actually fit and didn't have bullet holes in it. The men gave Kale a rifle to replace the one lost in the fire. You're always welcome here, Elena said as they prepared to leave. Both of you. If things go bad, you come back. Understand? Thank you, Lillian said, for everything. Thank Kyle. He's the one who sent word months ago to watch for you. Said if a woman with bruises and bare feet came looking for help, I should take her and no questions asked. Elena looked at Kyle. You knew she was going to run even before she did. I know what it looks like when someone's reached their breaking point, Kyle said quietly. They rode out of the canyon as the sun was rising, heading north toward the river, toward what was left of their home. Lillian rode in front, Kyle behind her with his good arm around her waist, and for the first time since she'd fled into that storm, she felt something that wasn't fear. She felt ready. The river looked the same as it always had, cottonwoods rustling, water flowing clear and cold, birds singing in the branches. But the cabin was gone, just a blackened scar on the earth with charred timbers sticking up like broken bones. Kale dismounted slowly, favoring his injured shoulder, and walked to the ruins. Stood there looking at them with an expression Lillian couldn't read. We can rebuild, she said, coming to stand beside him. Like you said, it won't be the same. No, it'll be better. He looked at her, eyebrow raised. This time, she said, we build it together. This time, it's not just your place or my place. It's ours. Kale was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Then we better get started, he said. But before they could do anything, they heard it, the sound of a horse approaching from the direction of Dry Hollow. Just one rider, moving at an easy pace. Kale's hand went to his rifle. Lillian moved behind him, her own pistol drawn. They waited as the rider came into view. It was Jesse. He rode up slowly, both hands visible on the saddle horn, no weapons drawn. When he was about 20 feet away, he stopped. Easy, he called out. I'm not here to fight. Then why are you here? Kale's rifle was pointed steady at Jesse's chest. To talk. Jesse looked at the burned cabin, at Kale and Lillian standing in the ruins, and to deliver a message. I'm not interested in anything Marcus has to say. It's not for Marcus. It's for me. Jesse shifted in his saddle. Marcus is dead. The words hung in the air like smoke. Lillian felt her knees go weak. What? Died 3 days ago. Heart gave out, doctors said. All that whiskey and rage finally caught up with him. Jesse's expression was unreadable. He's buried in Dry Hollow. Had a nice funeral. Half the town showed up to make sure he was really gone. And you rode all the way out here to tell us that? Kyle asked. Figured you had a right to know. Jesse looked at Lillian. You're free. Legally, the marriage died with him. And his will left everything to his brother in Kansas. You get nothing, but you're not bound to him anymore either. Lillian couldn't speak, couldn't process it. Marcus was dead, actually dead. The man who'd owned her, hurt her, hunted her, gone. There's something else, Jesse said. The town knows you're alive, knows you ran. Some folks are calling you a murderer, saying you hit him too hard and that's what caused the heart attack. Others are calling you brave for running at all. Point is, you show your face in Dry Hollow, there'll be trouble. We're not planning to, Kyle said. Good. Because I like you, Kale. Always have. And I never liked what Marcus did to her. He looked at Lillian again. You did what you had to do. Anyone says different, they can answer to me. He turned his horse to leave, then paused. One more thing. Marcus had cash hidden in his study. A lot of it. His brother won't find it, but I know where it is. Figure if anyone's got a claim to it, it's you. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather bag, tossed it to Kale. Consider it payment for a cabin you lost and trouble you didn't deserve. Then he rode away, and Lillian watched him go with tears streaming down her face. It's over, she whispered. It's really over. Kale pulled her against him, his good arm tight around her shoulders. Yeah, he said quietly. It's over. They stood there in the ruins of the cabin, holding each other while the sun climbed higher and the river sang its endless song. And for the first time in as long as Lillian could remember, she felt the weight lift from her chest. Marcus was dead. The past was buried, and the future was waiting. They burned the ruins 2 days later. Kyle said it was necessary, that leaving the charred skeleton of the old cabin standing would be like keeping a grave in their front yard. Lillian didn't argue. She helped him gather what timber was still intact enough to burn properly, stacking it in the center of what used to be the main room while he worked one-handed, his injured shoulder still healing. When everything was ready, Kyle handed her the match. You should do it, he said. Why me? Because this was his place before it was ours, and you're the one who walked away from him. Lillian looked at the match in her hand, then at the pile of blackened wood that represented everything that had happened here. The violence, the fear, the desperate last stand. She thought about Marcus lying in a grave 50 miles away, about Jesse riding back to Dry Hollow to tell everyone the runaway wife had disappeared for good. She struck the match and dropped it. The flames caught fast, hungry, consuming what was left of the old cabin with the same efficiency they'd used the first time. They stood back and watched it burn, Kyle's good arm around her shoulders, and Lillian felt something shift inside her chest. Not closure, she'd never believed in that, but maybe release. Where do we start? She asked when the flames had died down to embers. Kale looked at the cleared space, then at the river, then at the cottonwoods that had somehow survived the fire. Foundation, he said. We build it right this time, strong enough to last. They started the next morning. The money Jesse had brought, Marcus's hidden cash, turned out to be more than Lillian had expected. Enough to buy proper lumber from the Mexican traders, tools, nails, things they'd need to build something that wouldn't fall apart in the first strong wind. Kyle wanted to go to the settlement himself, but his shoulder wasn't healed enough for the ride. So Lillian went with 2 of Elena's sons as escorts, riding south with a list of supplies and a strange lightness in her chest. The settlement was bigger than she'd expected, maybe 40 buildings clustered around a central plaza, with a church at one end and a cantina at the other. People stared as she rode in, this Anglo woman with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands who spoke broken Spanish and carried a pistol like she knew how to use it. The lumber merchant was a fat man with kind eyes who tried to overcharge her until she pulled out the cash and counted it in front of him. His attitude changed fast after that. By noon, she had everything on Kyle's list and more. Good pine boards, a bag of decent nails, tar paper for the roof, even glass for windows. You building a house? the merchant asked as his sons loaded the wagon. Rebuilding one. By the river? Yes. He nodded slowly. I heard about the fire. Heard Marcus Vance's men did it looking for his runaway wife. He looked at her carefully. Heard she died in the flames. Lillian met his eyes. That's what I heard too. Good. That bastard deserved to lose something. He handed her the receipt. You need more supplies, you come back. I'll give you fair price. Why? Because anyone who runs from Marcus Vance and lives has earned my respect, and anyone who rebuilds has earned my business. She rode back to the river with the wagon full and her head clearer than it had been in months. Cale was sitting on a rock by the water when she returned, whittling something from a piece of wood. He looked up as the wagon rattled into view, and something in his expression eased. Thought you might not come back, he said. Where would I go? Anywhere. You're free now. Could head to California. Start fresh. Lillian climbed down from the wagon and walked over to him, sat down on the rock next to him and took the half-carved piece from his hands. It was a horse, delicate and detailed despite being worked one-handed. You think I stayed because I was trapped? She asked. I think you stayed because you're stubborn. I stayed because I wanted to. She handed the carving back. Because, for the first time in my life, I get to choose where I am and who I'm with. And I choose here, with you. Cale looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving across his face. Then he leaned over and kissed her, gentle and deliberate. You're going to regret that when you're hauling lumber in the heat, he said. Probably. They started building the next day. The foundation came first, rocks from the riverbed set in careful rows, mortar mixed from sand and lime that Elena's sons brought from the settlement. Cale couldn't lift heavy stones with his injured shoulder, so he measured and planned while Lillian did the heavy work. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her back ached every morning. But there was something satisfying about it, something real. You ever built anything before? Cale asked one afternoon, watching her set a cornerstone. No. You? Helped my father build lodges when I was young. Different style, but the principle's the same. Strong base, solid walls, roof that doesn't leak. Sounds simple. It's not. He was right. Nothing about building was simple. The lumber had to be cut to exact lengths, the joints had to fit together precisely, and every board had to be checked for rot or damage. Cale worked one-handed, using his teeth and his knees to hold things steady, and never complained even when Lillian could see the pain in his face. You should rest, she said, after catching him wincing for the third time in an hour. I'm fine. You're hurt. I've been hurt worse. That's not the point. Then what is the point? She set down the saw and faced him. The point is that you don't have to do everything yourself anymore. The point is that I'm here and I'm strong enough to help, and you need to let me. Cale stared at her, his jaw tight. Then he sat down heavily on a stack of lumber and rubbed his good hand over his face. I'm not used to this, he said quietly. Used to what? Having someone. Depending on someone. Trusting that they won't leave when things get hard. Lillian sat down beside him. I know, but I'm not leaving, so you might as well get used to it. He looked at her sideways, and something in his expression softened. You're bossy. You're stubborn. We're going to fight a lot, aren't we? Probably. He smiled then, a real smile, the kind that made his whole face change. Good. I was getting bored with all the peace and quiet. The walls went up slowly, one board at a time. They worked from dawn until the heat got too bad, then rested in the shade of the cottonwoods until the afternoon cooled enough to start again. Some days they made good progress. Other days they'd spend hours trying to get a single joint to fit right, or arguing about whether a board was level, or fixing mistakes from the day before. One afternoon, the whole south wall collapsed because they'd rushed the framing. Lillian sat in the dirt and looked at the pile of lumber and wanted to cry. We'll fix it, Cale said, pulling her to her feet. That's what building is. Messing up and fixing it and messing up again until you get it right. How many times did your father's lodges fall down? More than he liked to admit. They rebuilt the wall, this time taking the time to do it properly. It held. Elena came to visit 3 weeks into the building, riding up with her daughter and enough food to feed them for a week. She looked at the half-finished cabin, at the neat foundation and sturdy frame, and nodded approvingly. "You're doing good work," she said. "Better than I expected." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Kyle said dryly. "I meant it as a compliment. Most people would have given up by now." She looked at Lillian. "How are you holding up?" "Sore. Tired. Happy." "Happy? With all this work?" "It's different when you're building something for yourself instead of cleaning up after someone else's mess." Elena smiled. "Yes, I suppose it is." They stayed for dinner, eating under the stars while Elena told stories about Kyle as a boy, getting into fights, stealing horses as a dare, driving his mother to distraction with his recklessness. Kyle protested half of it, but Lillian could see the truth in his face, could imagine him wild and young and fearless. "What happened to them?" Lillian asked quietly. "Your mother and father?" The lightness went out of the conversation. Elena and her daughter exchanged glances. "The soldiers came," Kyle said, his voice flat. "The ones I brought in. They killed everyone. My mother, my father, my sisters, my cousins. Everyone except me and a handful who'd gone hunting." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's old history." But Lillian could see it wasn't. Could see the weight of it in the way he held himself, the shadows in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. She reached over and took his hand, and he let her. Elena left the next morning with a promise to come back in a few weeks. After she was gone, Kyle was quiet all day, working with a kind of controlled intensity that Lillian recognized. She'd seen it in herself, the need to keep moving, to keep working, to avoid thinking about things that hurt too much. That night they sat on the unfinished porch frame, watching the stars come out. The cabin was taking shape now, 4 walls, a roof frame, spaces left for windows and doors. It didn't look like much yet, but Lillian could see what it would become. "Tell me about them," she said. "Your family." "Why?" "Because they matter. Because they're part of who you are." Cale was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he started talking. He told her about his mother, who'd been the best tracker in the band and could read weather in the clouds. About his father, who'd made him practice with a bow until his arms shook because precision mattered more than strength. About his younger sisters, who'd followed him everywhere and driven him crazy with their questions. He told her about the day the soldiers came, about coming back from hunting to find smoke and bodies and nothing left of the life he'd known. About the guilt that had eaten at him for years, the certainty that it was his fault, his naivety, his stupid trust in a white man's promises. When he finished, his voice was rough and his eyes were wet. "I should have known better," he said. "Should have seen it coming. You were trying to save your people. That's not stupid. That's brave. It got them killed. The soldiers got them killed. The man who lied to you got them killed. You were just trying to find a way to survive." "That's what you tell yourself?" "Every day." She looked at him. "You think I don't blame myself for staying with Marcus as long as I did? You think I don't wonder what would have happened if I'd run sooner, fought harder, found the courage to leave before it got that bad? That's different." "How?" "Because you were trapped. You didn't have a choice." "And you did? What choice did you have? Watch your people starve, or try to trust someone who said they'd help?" She shook her head. "We both did what we thought we had to do, and we both survived. That's what matters." Cale looked at her, and something in his face cracked open. He pulled her against him, his arms tight around her, and she felt his shoulders shake with silent sobs. She held him while he broke, the way he'd held her so many times, and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. Some pain you just had to live through. After that night, something changed between them. Cale stopped treating the cabin like his project that she was helping with, and started treating it like something they were building together. He asked her opinion on where to put windows, how big to make the porch, whether they should add a small room off the back for storage. And when she suggested putting in a real floor instead of just packed dirt, he didn't argue, just started figuring out how to make it work. The roof went up in sections, tar paper first, and then the shingles they'd bought from the lumber merchant. It was dangerous work, especially with Kyle's shoulder still not fully healed, but they managed. Lillian held the ladder while he climbed, passed up boards and nails, tried not to think about what would happen if he fell. One afternoon, a board slipped and Kyle grabbed for it reflexively with his injured arm. Lillian heard him gasp, saw him go white, and was up the ladder before she thought about it. "Let me see," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Let me see." She unwrapped the bandage carefully and swore. The wound had reopened, blood seeping through the stitches Elena had put in weeks ago. "We need to stop," she said. "You're going to make it worse. We're almost done. I don't care. Get down from this roof before you pass out and break your neck." They climbed down, and Lillian rebandaged his shoulder with hands that shook more than she wanted to admit. When she was done, she sat back and glared at him. "You're an idiot," she said. "Noted. I'm serious, Cale. What good is a cabin if you're dead? I'm not going to die from a pulled stitch. You might if you keep being reckless." He looked at her for a long moment. "You sound like you care." "Of course I care, you idiot. She stopped, the words catching in her throat. "You what?" Lillian took a breath. "I love you. And I'd rather have an unfinished cabin and you alive than a finished cabin and you dead." The silence stretched out. Cale stared at her like she'd just spoken in a foreign language. "You don't mean that," he said finally. "Yes, I do. You barely know me. I know enough. Lillian, I know you saved my life when you didn't have to. I know you gave me a place to heal when I had nowhere else to go. I know you risked everything to protect me from Marcus's men. I know you wake up from nightmares and pretend you're fine even when you're not. I know you're careful with your words but generous with your actions. I know you carry guilt that isn't yours and refuse to forgive yourself for things that weren't your fault." She looked him in the eye. "So yeah, I know you. And I love you. Deal with it." Kyle sat very still. Then he reached up with his good hand and cupped her face. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly. "Good thing I'm not asking your permission." He kissed her then, deep and desperate, and when they broke apart, he pressed his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he said, in case that wasn't obvious. It wasn't. "You're terrible at expressing feelings." "Yeah, well, I'm working on it." They finished the roof the next week, working more carefully this time, with Lillian doing most of the climbing and Kyle directing from below. When the last shingle was nailed down, they stood back and looked at what they'd built. It wasn't perfect. The walls weren't quite straight, the windows were different sizes, and the porch had a slight tilt that no amount of adjusting seemed to fix. But it was solid. It was real. And it was theirs. "We should celebrate," Lillian said. "How?" "I don't know. People do that, right? When they finish building something?" Cale looked at the cabin, then at her, and smiled. "Come on. I have an idea." He led her down to the river, to a spot where the water pooled deep and calm, started pulling off his boots. "What are you doing?" Lillian asked. "Going swimming." "Your shoulder. We'll be fine. Come on." "When's the last time you did something just because it felt good?" Lillian couldn't remember. She pulled off her boots, her dress, everything, until she was standing in her underclothes, feeling self-conscious and exhilarated. Kyle was already in the water, the current tugging at his waist, his dark hair slicked back. She waded in and the cold hit her like a shock, stealing her breath. But then she got used to it, and it felt incredible. The water washing away weeks of sweat and sawdust and exhaustion. Kyle swam over, his good arm pulling him through the water. "See? Not dead yet. Give it time." He splashed her, she splashed him back, and suddenly they were playing like children, laughing and ducking under the water and forgetting for a moment about everything except the way the sun felt on their shoulders and the way they fit together. When they finally climbed out, shivering and dripping, Kyle pulled her close. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For staying, for building this with me, for making me remember what it feels like to have something worth protecting." Lillian kissed him, tasting river water and possibility. "We protect each other now," she said. "That's how this works." They moved into the cabin a week later, even though it wasn't quite finished. There was still trim to add, shelves to build, a proper door to hang instead of the blanket they'd been using. But the roof didn't leak, the walls kept out the wind, and the floor was level enough. It felt like home. That first night they lay on the bed Kyle had built. Simple frame, rope supports, mattress stuffed with grass that would need replacing in a few months, and listened to the sounds of the desert settling around them. "It's quiet," Lillian said. "Too quiet?" "No. Just different from Dry Hollow, different from everywhere." Kyle shifted, his arm tightening around her waist. "You miss it? The town? Other people?" "Not even a little bit." "You might. Eventually. This is isolated. We're miles from anywhere." "Good." "Lillian, I spent 3 years surrounded by people who either ignored me or pitied me. I don't need that anymore. I just need this. The river, the desert, you." She turned to look at him. "Is that enough for you? Just this?" He thought about it, his face serious in the dim light from the banked fire. "Yeah," he said finally, "it's enough." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of birds arguing in the cottonwoods. Over the next few weeks, they settled into a rhythm. Kyle hunted and fished, bringing back meat that Lillian learned to smoke and preserve. She planted a small garden near the cabin, beans, squash, peppers from seeds Elena had given her. Some of them took, some didn't, but the ones that survived grew strong in the desert sun. They finished the inside of the cabin slowly, in no particular hurry, built a table and 2 chairs, put up shelves for their few possessions, hung a mirror that Lillian had bought from the Mexican traders, even though Kyle said it was impractical. "Why do we need a mirror?" he asked. "So I can see what I look like." "You look beautiful." "You have to say that." "I don't have to say anything, but you do. Look beautiful, I mean." She looked at herself in the mirror, sun-darkened skin, calloused hands, hair that she'd cut short because long hair was impractical when you were working. She looked nothing like the pale, carefully groomed woman who'd lived in Marcus's house. Looked more like someone who belonged here, in this place with this man. "I look different," she said. "Different how?" "Like myself." Kyle came to stand behind her, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Yeah, you do." One evening, about 6 weeks after Marcus's death, a rider came up the river path. Lillian saw him first and called for Kyle, who grabbed his rifle and stepped out onto the porch. But it wasn't Marcus's men. It was Jesse again, riding the same tired horse, looking older somehow than the last time they'd seen him. "Easy," he called out. "Just bringing news." "What kind of news?" Kyle kept the rifle ready. "The good kind. Marcus's brother came and went, took what he wanted and left Dry Hollow to rot. Most folks are moving on, going to California or back east or wherever they think they can make a living. Town's dying." "Why are you telling us this?" "Because I figured you'd want to know that nobody's looking for you anymore. Nobody cares. Far as anyone knows, Lillian Vance died in the desert and Kyle shot at some men who were trespassing." Jesse looked at the cabin, at the fresh lumber and glass windows. "Looks like you're doing all right for yourselves." "We're managing," Lillian said, stepping out onto the porch beside Kyle. Jesse's expression softened when he saw her. "You look good. Healthy. Different." "I am different." "Yeah, I can see that." He shifted in his saddle. "Look, I know we weren't exactly friends, but I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. For not standing up to Marcus, for hunting you that first time, for all of it." "You were doing your job," Kyle said. "Doesn't make it right." Jesse looked between them. "You two planning to stay here?" "As long as the land will have us," Lillian said. "Good. You deserve some peace." He touched his hat. "Take care of each other." He rode away, and they watched him go until he disappeared around the bend in the river. "That's it then," Kale said quietly. "It's really over." "Yeah, it is." They stood on the porch of the cabin they'd built together, watching the sun set over the desert, and Lillian felt the last piece of her old life fall away. She wasn't Marcus's wife anymore. Wasn't the scared woman who'd run barefoot into a storm. She was just Lillian, standing next to Kyle, in front of a home they'd made from ashes and stubbornness and love. "What do we do now?" she asked. Kale pulled her close. "Whatever we want. That's the point of freedom." And for the first time in her life, Lillian understood what he meant. The seasons turned and the desert changed with them. Winter came first, bringing cold nights that frosted the windows and made the fireplace essential instead of decorative. Lillian and Kyle huddled close under blankets, feeding wood into the flames and listening to coyotes sing in the distance. The garden died back, but the food they'd preserved, smoked meat, dried beans, vegetables packed in salt, kept them fed. Some days they didn't see another soul, just them, the river, and the endless sky. Lillian found she didn't mind the isolation. After years of being watched, judged, controlled, the emptiness felt like permission to breathe. One morning in late December, she woke to find snow falling. Rare this far south, but it happened. Fat flakes drifting down like ash, covering the desert in white. Kyle was already up, standing on the porch in just his pants and boots, his breath misting in the cold air. "You're going to freeze," Lillian said, wrapping a blanket around herself and joining him. "Worth it." He gestured at the transformed landscape. "Haven't seen snow like this in years." They stood together watching it fall, and Lillian thought about how strange it was that something so simple could feel so profound. Snow in the desert. A home built from ruins. A life chosen instead of endured. "I want to marry you," Kyle said suddenly. Lillian turned to look at him. "What?" "I want to marry you, properly, not like whatever you had with Marcus, a real choice. I was married. It ended badly. Why would I want to do that again? Because this time it would mean something. This time you'd be choosing it." She thought about it, watching the snow settle on the porch rail. Marriage to Marcus had been a transaction, his money and protection in exchange for her compliance and silence, a cage with legal paperwork. "What would be different?" she asked. "Everything. No one owns anyone. No promises to obey or serve or be anything except yourself. Just two people deciding to face whatever comes next together." "We're already doing that." "I know. But I want to make it official. Want you to have my name if you want it. Want everyone who sees us to know you chose this." He looked at her, and there was something vulnerable in his eyes. "Want to choose you in front of witnesses and mean it." Lillian felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "All right. All right. Yes, I'll marry you, but not in a church and not with a preacher who will tell me I have to obey." "How about Elena? She's married half the people in the settlement. She can do it however we want." "Then yes, let's do it." Kyle smiled, that rare full smile that transformed his whole face, and pulled her into a kiss that tasted like snow and coffee and possibility. They rode to the settlement a week later through cold, clear air that made the desert look sharp and new. Elena took one look at them and started laughing. "I knew it," she said. "I told my daughter, I said those two will be married before spring. She didn't believe me." "We want to keep it simple," Kyle said. "Just us and whoever wants to witness." "Simple I can do." "Tomorrow morning?" "Tomorrow's good." They married at dawn by the settlement's small plaza, with Elena presiding and maybe 20 people watching, Mexican traders, a few Apache families who'd known Kyle's parents, Elena's extended family. Lillian wore a simple dress Elena's daughter had lent her, pale blue cotton with embroidered flowers at the hem. Kyle wore clean clothes and his hair tied back, and when he took her hand, his palm was rough and warm and steady. Elena spoke in Spanish and English both, talking about commitment and respect and the choice to build a life with someone despite knowing it would be hard. She didn't mention obedience or submission or any of the words that had made Lillian feel trapped the first time. Just talked about partnership and trust and showing up for each other when things got difficult. "Do you choose this?" Elena asked Lillian, freely, with no pressure, knowing you could walk away right now if you wanted. "I choose this," Lillian said, and meant it with everything she had. "And you?" Elena turned to Kyle. "Do you promise to see her as your equal, to respect her choices, to support her freedom even when it's inconvenient?" "I promise," Kyle said. "Then by the authority vested in me by common sense and community recognition, I declare you married. Kiss her before I change my mind." Kyle did, and the small crowd cheered, and Lillian felt tears on her face that had nothing to do with sadness. They stayed at the settlement for 2 days, celebrating with people who barely knew them but welcomed them anyway. The traders brought food and wine, someone produced a guitar, and they danced in the plaza under stars so bright they looked like ice. Kyle was a terrible dancer, stiff and self-conscious, but he tried anyway because Lillian wanted to. And when he stepped on her foot for the third time, they both started laughing so hard they had to sit down. "This is good," Lillian said, watching people swirl around them. "Being around others. I didn't think I'd like it, but I do." "We can come back," Kyle said. "Not often, but sometimes. When we need supplies or company or just a reminder that other people exist." "I'd like that." They rode home the next day, married and tired and happy, in a way that felt almost foreign. The cabin looked smaller after the bustle of the settlement, but also more welcoming. Their place, their choice. Spring arrived in a rush of green and heat and sudden storms that swelled the river and turned the desert floor into a carpet of wildflowers that lasted maybe 3 weeks before the sun burned them away. Lillian's garden came back stronger than before. Beans climbing poles Kyle had built, squash spreading across the ground, peppers standing in neat rows. She spent hours tending it, learning what worked in this soil and what didn't, and felt a satisfaction she'd never found in anything Marcus had given her. One afternoon, while Lillian was weeding, she heard horses approaching. Multiple riders moving slow. Her heart jumped, old fear rising before she could stop it. But Kyle was already standing, his hand on the rifle, watching the path. 3 riders appeared, a man and 2 women, travel-worn and dusty. The man raised his hand in greeting. "Easy, friend," he called out. "We're just passing through. Heard there was good water here." Cale didn't lower the rifle. "Where you headed?" "California. Heard there's work in the gold fields." "There's water," Cale said. "You can fill your canteens, then move on." The man nodded and dismounted. The women followed, one older, maybe 40, with tired eyes and a mouth set in a permanent line of endurance. The other younger, barely 20, with a baby strapped to her chest. Lillian watched the younger woman walk to the river, saw the way she moved, careful, like every step hurt. Saw the fading bruise on her jaw that makeup couldn't quite hide. She walked over before she thought about it. "You all right?" Lillian asked quietly. The young woman looked up, startled. "Fine, just tired from the road." "That bruise on your face. How'd you get it?" The woman's hand went to her jaw reflexively. "I fell, clumsy." Lillian had said those exact words to herself in the mirror 100 times, had believed them too, for longer than she should have. "I was married to a man who hit me," Lillian said, "so I know what falling looks like, and that's not it." The young woman's eyes filled with tears. She looked over at the man, her husband probably, who was talking with Kyle and filling canteens. "It's fine," she whispered. "He's just stressed about the journey. Once we get to California, once he finds work, it'll get better." "It won't." Lillian kept her voice gentle. "Men like that don't get better. They just get better at making you believe you deserve it." "I can't just leave. I have a baby, no money, nowhere to go." "You could stay here." The woman looked at her like she'd spoken in tongues. "What?" "Stay. We have space, we can use the help, and your husband can keep heading to California without you." "He'd never allow it." "He doesn't get to allow or disallow anything. It's your choice." The woman stared at her, tears running down her face now. Then she looked at the cabin, at the garden, at Lillian's sun-darkened face and calloused hands. "Did you run?" she asked. "From your husband?" "Yes." "Was it worth it?" Lillian thought about that night in the storm, about bleeding feet and blind terror and the certainty she was going to die in the desert, about Kyle pulling her from the wash, about building the cabin board by board, about choosing to stay when she could have run. "Every second of it," she said. The young woman took a shaking breath. Then she nodded, just once. Her name was Sarah, and the older woman was her mother-in-law, Ruth. When Sarah told her husband she was staying, he erupted, shouting about wifely duty and legal rights and how she was making a mistake. Kyle stepped between them with the rifle, and something about the way he held it made the man shut up. "She said she's staying," Kyle said flatly. "You got a problem with that? You can take it up with me." The man looked at Kyle, at the rifle, at Sarah standing behind him with her chin raised and her baby clutched tight. "Fine," he spat. "Keep her. She was useless anyway." He rode away alone, and good riddance. Ruth stayed too, said if her son was fool enough to abandon his wife and child, She wasn't going to be part of it. She was a tough old woman with hands like leather and a spine like steel, and within a week she was running the garden like a general commanding troops. Sarah was quieter, jumpier, still flinching when anyone moved too fast. But Lillian saw herself in the girl and knew what she needed: time, space, work to fill the hours. So they gave her simple tasks at first, building up to harder ones as her confidence grew. And slowly, over weeks and then months, Sarah started to straighten, started to smile, started to believe she might survive this. The cabin got crowded with 4 adults and a baby, so they built an addition, a small room off the back where Sarah and Ruth could sleep. The work went faster with more hands, and Lillian found she liked having other women around, liked teaching Sarah to shoot, to plant, to stand her ground, liked Ruth's dry humor and no-nonsense attitude. "You're building something here," Ruth said one evening, watching Kyle and Lillian work together to fix a section of fence the wind had damaged. "Not just a cabin, a place people can come when they need it." "We're not running a refuge," Lillian said. "Aren't you? Girl shows up running from a bad husband, and you take her in no questions asked. That's a refuge." Lillian thought about that, about being the person she'd needed when she was running, about giving others what Kyle had given her, a chance to breathe, to heal, to figure out who they were without someone else defining it for them. "Maybe," she said, "but we can't take in everyone." "No, but you can take in the ones who make it this far, the ones who are desperate enough or brave enough to keep running when everything says to stop." Ruth looked at her. "You were one of those. Sarah was too. There'll be more." She was right. Over the next year, others came. A man running from debts, who worked for 2 months to pay them off and then moved on. A pair of sisters fleeing an arranged marriage who stayed for a season and then headed to Mexico. An old prospector who'd been beaten and robbed and just needed somewhere to heal before he tried his luck again. Some stayed days, some stayed months. A few stayed longer, helping build new additions to the cabin, working the expanding garden, becoming part of the strange little community growing by the river. Cale grumbled about the crowding, but Lillian noticed he was always the first to pull out his rifle when someone showed up scared, always the first to share food, always willing to teach someone to hunt or track or survive in the desert. "You're going soft," Lillian teased him one night after they'd taken in a teenage boy who'd run from an apprenticeship that was just slavery by another name. "I'm being practical. More hands means more work gets done." "You're being kind." "Don't spread that around. I have a reputation." She kissed him. "Your secret's safe with me." The seasons turned again. Summer scorched everything. Autumn brought relief. Winter returned with cold winds and occasional snow. Lillian's garden became the talk of the settlement. Elena brought people to see it, to learn how she coaxed food from desert soil. The cabin expanded again. Then again, becoming less a single building and more a cluster of structures connected by covered walkways and shared purpose. Travelers started calling it Ash River Station, a place to rest, trade, heal. Some brought supplies to trade for food and shelter. Others brought news from California, from Mexico, from the territories back east. Lillian and Kyle never asked for payment, but people left things anyway. Tools, seeds, occasionally money that went into a jar for supplies they couldn't make themselves. One spring morning, 2 years after they'd married, Lillian woke feeling wrong. Not sick exactly, but off. Her body felt different, her stomach unsettled in a way that had nothing to do with food. She knew before she said anything, knew from the tenderness in her breasts, the exhaustion that hit her at odd hours, the way certain smells suddenly made her want to vomit. She'd been pregnant once before, years ago with Marcus, and lost it in the 2nd month after he'd shoved her into a table during an argument. Had been almost relieved when it was gone, because bringing a child into that house would have been cruel. This was different. She told Cale that evening, sitting on the porch watching the sunset, just said it straight out because there was no gentle way to deliver news that would change everything. "I'm pregnant." He went very still. "You're sure?" "Pretty sure." "How do you feel about it?" She thought about that, about the fear that came with bringing a child into an uncertain world, about the joy that surprised her rising up through the fear like a spring through rock. "Terrified," she said honestly, "but also happy. Is that stupid? No. He took her hand. How do you feel about it? Same. Terrified. Happy. He looked at her, and there was something fierce in his eyes. But this time will be different. This time, the child will be wanted, protected, loved. You think we can do this? Raise a kid out here? I think we've done harder things. The pregnancy was rough. Morning sickness that lasted all day, exhaustion that made simple tasks feel impossible, swelling in her hands and feet that made her clumsy. Sarah and Ruth took over most of the garden work, and the rotating cast of travelers picked up the slack without being asked. Cale hovered constantly, driving Lillian crazy with his worry until she finally snapped at him to give her space. I'm pregnant, not dying, she said. I know, but nothing. I need you to trust that I'll ask for help when I need it, and leave me alone when I don't. He backed off, but she caught him watching when he thought she wasn't looking, saw the fear in his eyes that something would go wrong, that he'd lose her, that history would repeat itself in the worst possible way. Elena came to stay a month before the baby was due, bringing her daughter who'd helped deliver half the children in the settlement. They set up in one of the spare rooms and waited. The baby came on a hot August night, after hours of labor that left Lillian exhausted and sweating and absolutely certain she was going to die. Cale stayed with her the whole time, holding her hand, letting her curse at him, wiping her face with cool water. When the baby finally came, a girl, healthy and screaming, he cried so hard he had to sit down. She's perfect, he kept saying. She's perfect. Lillian held their daughter and felt something fundamental shift in her chest. This tiny red-faced creature who'd just emerged into the world squalling. She was theirs, their choice, their future. What should we name her? Kyle asked. Lillian thought about names from her past, from his, from all the people they'd lost and left behind. Then she looked out the window at the cottonwoods by the river, at the desert stretching toward mountains that had witnessed everything they'd been through. Sage, she said, for the desert that kept us alive. Sage. Kyle tried it out, then smiled. Yeah, that's good. The baby changed everything and nothing. The work continued, garden, hunting, taking in travelers who needed shelter. But now there was an infant in the mix, crying at odd hours, needing constant attention. Lillian was exhausted in a way she'd never been before, even during the worst days of building the cabin. But it was a good exhaustion, an earned one. Kyle was surprisingly good with the baby, would walk her around the property at night when she was fussy, singing in Apache, songs his mother had sung to him, would change her without complaint, rock her to sleep, make faces to get her to smile. Seeing this hard, stoic man turn into mush over their daughter made Lillian fall in love with him all over again. Ruth and Sarah stayed, becoming the grandmothers Sage would never have otherwise. The rotating cast of travelers brought gifts, a carved rattle, a soft blanket, a tiny dress stitched from flour sacks. The cabin that had started as a refuge for two became a home for many, and Lillian found she didn't mind. This was what family looked like when you built it yourself. Messy, chaotic, chosen. Years passed. Sage grew from infant to toddler to a wild little girl who climbed everything and asked endless questions and had absolutely no fear of the desert. More travelers came and went. Some stayed. The cluster of buildings by the river expanded into something almost like a small village, a dozen structures housing maybe 30 people at any given time. Elena died when Sage was 4, peacefully in her sleep at the settlement. Kyle took it hard, disappearing into the desert for 3 days to grieve alone. When he came back, he was quiet for weeks, carving birds with intense focus and leaving them scattered around the property like offerings. Ruth died a year later, her body just wearing out. Sarah mourned her mother-in-law like the mother she'd never had, then surprised everyone by marrying one of the traders who'd been passing through regularly. They built a house on the other side of the river, and Sarah bloomed into someone Lillian barely recognized from the scared girl who'd shown up years ago. Jesse came by once, maybe 5 years after they'd married. He was older, grayer, moving slow. Told them Dry Hollow was a ghost town now, just a few stubborn holdouts clinging to minds that had long since played out. Marcus's house had burned down in a fire nobody bothered to put out. "Whole place is dead," Jesse said, "like it never existed." "Good. Lillian said. Yeah, good. He looked around at the buildings, the garden, the children playing by the river. You built something better. He left the next morning and they never saw him again. Heard later from traders that he'd died somewhere in Arizona, peaceful and alone. The news should have affected Lillian more than it did. Jessie had been part of her old life, a connection to everything she'd run from. But standing there with Sage tugging at her skirt and Kael's arm around her shoulders, she felt nothing except a vague sadness for anyone who died alone. She had people now, had family, had something worth protecting. On Lillian's 40th birthday, they threw a celebration. Not because she particularly wanted one, but because Sage insisted, and what Sage wanted, Sage usually got. Half the settlement showed up. Traders, travelers who'd stayed, families who'd built homes nearby. Someone brought a fiddle, someone else brought whiskey, and they danced in the clearing by the river under stars that looked close enough to touch. Kael pulled her close during a slow song, his arms around her waist. You happy? He asked. Lillian looked around at the people laughing and talking, at the buildings they'd built, at Sage spinning in circles with other children, looked at Kyle's face, older now, with lines around his eyes and silver starting in his hair. Yeah, she said. I am. Are you? More than I ever thought I'd be. He kissed her forehead. You know what I think about sometimes? What? That night in the storm, when I pulled you out of the wash, I almost didn't stop. Almost kept riding because getting involved in someone else's mess seemed like a bad idea. What changed your mind? I saw your eyes. Even scared and running and half dead, you were still fighting, still refusing to quit. And I thought, that's someone worth knowing. I'm glad you stopped. Me too. They danced until Lillian's feet hurt and the stars started to fade toward dawn. Then they walked back to the cabin, older now, bigger, but still the same at its core, and fell asleep wrapped around each other the way they had for years. Lillian dreamed of storms and running and a younger version of herself who'd thought death in the desert was better than life in a cage. Woke up grateful that girl had been wrong, that she'd found something better than death and better than survival. She'd found a life worth living. The desert sun rose over Ash River Station, painting the buildings gold and setting the cottonwoods on fire with light. The river flowed steady, the way it always had, the way it always would, and in the cabin she'd built from ashes and stubbornness and love, Lillian opened her eyes to another day. Sage was already up, probably bothering the chickens or trying to convince someone to let her ride the horses. Kael was still asleep beside her, his face peaceful in the early light. Outside, she could hear voices, people starting their day, going about their work, living lives they'd chosen instead of ones they'd been forced into. This was what freedom looked like. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Lillian got up, pulled on her clothes, and stepped out onto the porch. The desert stretched out before her, endless, unforgiving, beautiful. The same desert that had almost killed her was now home. The same emptiness that had terrified her was now comfort. She'd run into this desert with nothing and built a world. And standing there in the morning light, watching the sun climb higher, and feeling the day begin, Lillian understood something she'd never quite believed before. She was enough. She always had been. The running, the fear, the years of being told she was broken, none of it defined her. What defined her was what she'd built after, the choices she'd made, the people she'd helped, the life she'd forged from the wreckage of the old one. Kael came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, kissed her shoulder. Morning, he said. Morning. What are you thinking about? She leaned back against him, solid and warm and real. That we made it, she said. Against all odds, despite everything, we actually made it. Yeah, we did. Sage came running around the corner, already dirty and grinning, a chicken feather stuck in her hair. Mama, Papa. The trader from Santa Fe is here and he has candy. And can I have some, please, please, please? Lillian laughed and reached down to pull the feather from her daughter's hair. Go ask Ruth, she said, then remembered Ruth was gone. Ask Sarah, but just one piece. Sage whooped and ran off. Kael chuckled against Lillian's shoulder. She's going to be trouble, he said. She's already trouble. She's our trouble. Yeah, she is. They stood there together on the porch they'd built, watching their daughter disappear into the cluster of buildings that had grown up around them. And Lillian felt something she'd never thought she'd feel after running into that storm all those years ago. She felt at home. Not because the desert was safe, it wasn't. Not because life was easy, it rarely was. But because she'd chosen this. Every day, with every sunrise, she chose to be here, to stay, to keep building. And that made all the difference. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and river water and distant rain. Somewhere in the settlement, someone was singing. Somewhere else, a hammer rang against an anvil, probably the blacksmith who'd shown up last month and decided to stay. Life continuing, work getting done, people choosing to make something from nothing. Cale's arms tightened around her waist. I love you, he said quietly. I love you too. Think we'll still be saying that when we're old and gray? We're already getting old and gray. Older then. When sage is grown and we're too stiff to do the work ourselves. Lillian thought about it, about years stretching ahead, full of change and challenge and the everyday work of living, about getting older together in this place they'd made, surrounded by people they'd chosen. Yeah, she said, I think we will. And she meant it. The sun climbed higher, the desert woke fully, and in the cluster of buildings by Ash River, people went about their lives, working, laughing, surviving, thriving. Building futures from fragments of broken paths. This was what it looked like when you refused to let the world break you. When you ran into the storm and came out the other side still fighting. When you took ashes and built a home. Took pain and made it purpose. Took fear and turned it into strength. This was what it looked like to be free. Lillian took a deep breath of desert air, let it fill her lungs, let it remind her that she was alive and whole and exactly where she was meant to be. Then she kissed Kyle, went inside to start breakfast, and got on with the business of living the life she'd chosen, the life she'd earned, the life that was, finally and completely, her own.